Thank you very much. Can you hear me? If I speak like this? Okay. It's a pleasure to be invited to the Cambridge Forum and to talk about issues of perception in my own poetry and my practice as a poet. When Patricia Serkey suggested the topic, I thought for the first time in many years of the very first poem that I ever learned by heart. It's probably familiar to many of you. Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you, but when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I, but when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. This little lyric by Christina Rossetti was in fact something that I had misremembered because all through my childhood I thought the final lines were, when the boughs bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. When the B-O-U-G-H is B-O-W, down their heads. And I used to love, and I still love, my mistake because the comparison between the visible and the invisible at work in the sound and touch of the poem seemed to me much more interesting with those silent letters. And I somehow thought those silent letters were something like the invisible wind that we can both that we can both feel and hear. The other part of that poem that's stayed with me is that it's a great poem of reciprocity. It's often very difficult for children to understand how they can be I at one moment and you at another, and the poem explores that, of course, in some depth, considering how short it is. So let me say at the outset that it seems to me that the natural world is the source of all possible themes and styles and designs in works of art. And when I say that, it may sound as if I think there's some opposition between the natural world and some non-natural world where art might also find a trove of possibilities. But that's not the case at all. Instead, I'm thinking of the artist as a living being who inhabits a body and encounters an animate world that appears to her under constant change and perhaps development. That world is at the same time shaped by our expectations and our own changes and development. And we respond to the manifold of all the forms and patterns of life, including other works of art that are part of the unfinished task of our culture. I see making poems as one way of coming to know what I think and sharing language with others in its most intense and considered forms. So when I think of perception in poetry, I don't think of merely registering or noting information through the senses, but instead of a process of shaping and filling my world. Marx pointed out in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 that the senses had a history, and that history was tied up with a sense of human needs and desires. And he thought, or he imagined, that we might develop new senses in the future, including, you can almost see him struggling to think of an example, a mineralogical sense, where we would have a more intense apprehension of the qualities of rocks and stones. But why stop there? In making poems, perceptions, including perceptions of imagination and memory, might be the starting point always where one rhythm leads to another and becomes embodied. Perception involves thinking, and thinking involves perception. As Kant famously said, concepts without percepts are empty, and percepts without concepts are blind. When you say that at Harvard, I expect some bells to ring or something. That didn't happen. Poets are the lucky recipients of certain gifts or natural resources, not just what appears in the field of attention, but a sense of the rest of the repertoire of inherited poetic forms, all of the sights and sounds and glimpses and whispers and silences that poetry has offered. Meanwhile, the vibration of the poem is in the world and picks up on the vibrations of other living and moving things. So this might sound a little mystical, and to turn away from the conceptual, I'd like to read the two poems that you've been given as a handout, and maybe then we can talk more deeply about how this works. The first poem that you have called Voiceover, is also a fairly recent poem. It was written in response to an invitation I had to contribute to a special issue of a Belgian art journal about practices of transcription. Now, I don't want to hurt the feelings of the engineer and photographer, but I don't hold to transcription as a means of writing poetry. And in fact, I'm often opposed in general to transcribing and recording things, for I find we can be so busy proleptically planning to remember our lives that we forget to live them. So I wanted in this poem to run notation up against listening during a spring walk, and then write down my sense of what had happened. In other words, I thought that rather than shape the experience through any prior ideas, I would let the experience write my consciousness of it. Voiceover. Undergrowth in creek, guttural, the quarreling squirrels. A deckle-edged spring, 3 hollow rata woodpecker on the right, on the left, or echo, landscapes thinking to sketch them, concentrating, a rumph, the bullfrog grown now singular, close on particulars that otherwise would not exist. There is something where once the peepers sang chaos, mounting heat here, heat here, inherently sentimental about the idea. Heat here, heat, just a month ago. It's neither here nor there, but then that's what it means. Weedle, sweet meetcha. To draw your way toward it. Silent pair of finches just ahead, vanished gold. The basin-deep skunk cabbage, leaves brimful of yesterday's rain. And the hissing geese, their wheezing breasts inflating, the grasses wound around and through them, while their green infant, phosphorescent, fuzzed, scrambles, sentimental like a pressed flower that will lose its color. Across the path, the smaller the being, the more pronounced, the plastic debris inert, the silence. That's the difference, the draped, dirty tangle of torn grocery bags. With an ear to the ground, even beetles make a rumble. Inertness, irreducible, growth, grown, impossible. Nattering, tattered, spare, narrating sparrows, the never of it. Ka-kawa, ka-kawa, ka-ka-kawa, the always mates for life. And the effort to record came forward in all, hermit thrush cascade, first flex, then luscious spilling, its own plasticity. Who wheat, who wheat. The lifelike plastic, taxidermic, pure arsenic. Cheer, 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 cheer. Though words in life, are like water. Many of you probably remember Wordsworth's contradictory suggestion in his preface to Lyrical Ballads that poetry is on the one hand the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and on the other, emotion recollected in tranquility. And for many years I've been troubled by this dichotomy, but I also think that somehow it speaks to the desire of every poet to be surprised in the process of writing, and hope some of that surprise, of course, carries over to the reader. So the second poem that I'll read, The Owl, which you have also, is one that I wrote in contrast over many months, more than a year in fact. It began in an encounter that was not quite sublime, yet also not really intelligible to me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and the poem is about thinking about it. The poem's rather obsessive iambic form, dun dun, dun dun, as you know, came out of the rhythm of my thinking, and I wasn't even aware I was using it until I was working on a very late draft. And then later someone complained about it, so, all right. The Owl. I thought somehow a piece of cloth was tossed into the night, a piece of cloth that flew up, then across beyond the window. A tablecloth or handkerchief, a knot somehow unfolding, folded, pushing through the thickness of the dark. I thought somehow a piece of cloth was lost beyond the line, released, although it seemed as if a knot still hung unfolding. Some human hand could not have thrown that high or lent such force to cloth, and yet I knew no god would mind a square of air so small, and still it moved, and still it swooped and disappeared beyond the pane. The after image went, a blot beyond the icy glass, and closer there stood winter, grass so black it had no substance, until I looked again and saw it tipped with brittle frost. An acre there, a commonplace, a line of trees, a line of stars. So look it up. You'll find that you could lose your sense of depth. A leaf, a sheaf of paper, pillow case, or heart-shaped face, a shrieking hiss like winds, like death, all tangled there in branches. I called this poem The Owl, the name that like a key locked out the dark, and later let me close my book and sleep a winter dream. And yet the truth remains that I can't know just what I saw, and if it comes each night, each dream, each star, or not at all, it's never evident that waiting has no reason. The circuit of the world belies the chaos of its forms, the kind of thing astronomers look down to write in books. And still I thought a piece of cloth had flown outside my window, or human hands had freed a wing, or churning gods revealed themselves, or greater news, a northern owl, a snowy owl, descended. So I'll stop there, and I guess there are questions.
I have a number of questions, but what I would like to do is maybe ask one, two, and not monopolize, and I hope act as a catalyst for questions that might be forming in your minds. But I'll start with this one because the issue of slowness is clearly a concern of yours. And I think that poetry requires the slowest readers. That phrase, to read your lips, or to move your lips while reading, with poetry, it's not a pejorative. And I'm interested in whatever notion you have, or maybe even advice on how reading poetry, not necessarily out loud, is both a mental but also a physical act.
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I saw the Cambridge Forum had emphasized that I said this in a slightly different context. I think first I want to explain that when I say a slow art form, I do have reading in mind, so I would agree with that. But I would also say that there are moments in composing poetry where things come very, very fast. And almost at a frightening pace, I would say, a kind of blur. And then the task for me of composing or revising, or really what writing is trying to understand the nature of that blur and trying to get some distinction between images and sounds. And so things from that point on move more and more slowly. And when I'm writing poems, it takes me forever to finish a poem, I think. I mean, it takes at least a year, and then it takes me many years to figure out the structure of a book. So, and that's a pleasure to me to take as much time as I want, because nobody's pressing me to write poetry, especially on time. But I think that this question of reading poetry is really important, and part of what poetry in the schools can do from a very young age, all the way up until graduate school, and later, just encouraging people to read very, very slowly. Reading silently slowly, I think, is even quite different from reading out loud slowly, and a poem deserves every form of reading. Unless you read a poem out loud, you can't hear all the resonance of the sound, obviously, but often you don't even really know what words you're reading unless you hear them up against the sound of other words. But reading silently also, reading one word at a time, one line at a time, reading through and going back. I mean, of course, the beautiful thing is having poems in your life, your whole life, and returning to those poems that, in those books of poems that mean so much to you, and finding them completely transformed by the transformed circumstances of your life. I won't give such a long answer to every question if asked.
And people, please, interrupt me or feel free to come up to the microphone to ask a question. What you just said made me think of a question that I wrote 2 days ago, which is interesting. Robert Pinsky's referred to poetry as the instrument that plays its reader. And it uses the reader's breath, tongue, larynx, teeth to produce, with the reader's participation, the sounds of its sense. So naturally, he reads his poems out loud as he works on them. The poet Louise Glick has said that she never reads her poems out loud as she works on them, since she's striving to fasten to the page a voice she hears in her head. And I'm interested in where you might fit on that continuum as you compose your poems, and why does that position feel like the right one for you?
Well, I find it surprising that Louise said she doesn't read her poems out loud, because I do think that our poems, my poems are a voice in my head, although often that voice is full of other people's voices, voices of the dead, voices of other poems. I'm often surprised when I see the voices to know what they actually are. I couldn't imagine writing a poem without reading it out loud. In fact, almost reading it out loud at the point of every few words. And I have to keep reading it out loud. I can't really see it. I mean, it's interesting. I would say I really literally can't see it unless I hear it. Whereas I probably could hear it without seeing it, but I haven't tried that, so I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just found that so interesting that someone could be so wedded to mouth sounds and mean it literally as he composes, and someone could be so wedded to the sounds that stay in the interior, and that they both produce persuasive poetry.
I did have one other thing to say, though, and I realized that about the question of playing the reader, because I do think that it's great in any kind of writing to reward the patient, close reader. And so I like to put small patterns of repetition or small allusions within the structure of a book so that the reader can find those. But those people who are in a hurry will get something, I hope. They just won't get that.
Questions from the audience? Please come up to the microphone because we want the world to hear you.
Hi. I wondered if you could speak a bit about the value of memorizing others' poetry in the service either of writing your own or of appreciating poetry or the world in general.
Well, I think that it's an incredibly important and valuable process. I don't like it when people are forced to memorize. I know some people make it an assignment, but as you may have discovered yourselves, when you really love a poem and you know it well, you just memorize it. It just becomes part of your somatic memory, as part of your body. And I also think that that's the best way to teach young people or people who's learning to read poetic forms. When you have poems you love and you know they're in a certain form, then that becomes the paradigm of the form for you. So I think it's great. I had a really cruel math teacher in 6th grade who used to make us add long columns of numbers while she whacked a ruler on the table or on the desk. And so there's something about forced memorization that really makes my mind go blank. We lost a person because someone asked a question.
Actually, I have kind of a three-part question. The first one is, I would love if you could just explain how you go about the process of writing. I mean, do you take a camera? Do you take something to keep track of things? Because you have such intense detail. Does that come as a result of very careful observation at first, or do you take a camera or some kind of thing that you can use later when you go back? And then also, when you go to do poetry, do you consciously say, okay, I'm going to go do a poem, so I'm going to go to a place that will stimulate that poem? Or do you do it the other way around? You go to a place or have an experience, and the poem comes a bit later. And then my final question, I read your poem about the death of the children killed in Pennsylvania. And I'm interested in knowing the impact of such a horrendous thing. You're such a pleasant person. It must be very difficult as a poet, to have that level of sensitivity and be aware of the kind of tragedy that occurs. And I'd like to hear your observation, actually, I guess, kind of on the spirituality of observing such terrible events in the life of others, and have the gift to translate that into a form that others can follow.
Well, right. Let me answer your questions in order. I'll try to. I don't know how to work a camera, so no, I don't use the camera. I do sketch, and I've sketched since I was a child, and I think that I find that drawing helps me see. And of course, though, when you draw, you have to be still. So I also think of writing poetry as tied to walking and thinking while I'm walking. So I don't really think of those two activities as part of the same mode of poetic composition, although I think my drawing does help me be a better observer. But it's just astonishing how much we can't see and how much we don't see. It's at least as interesting as what we do see. In terms of the question of how I compose poetry in general, I don't have a fixed way of doing it, and I don't tie myself to my desk. I usually have a piece of language or an image or some kind of conceptual knot in my head that I can't figure out, and I like to sit down and work on it through poems, because poems do help me understand things, and then gradually, as a poem becomes more and more finished, I think of it as something going out into the world and speaking to other people, but that's a long, long process. And finally, you ask about the elegy I wrote for the Amish girls from West Sninkle Mines who were killed several years ago. I grew up very close to where that happened, and the Amish were part of my life and still are in many ways. Many of my people in my family live next to the Amish and know Amish people. And I was, I would say, speechless in responding to the crime. At the same time, I thought that it was something that couldn't be addressed through journalism, and I wanted to write a poem. I took as my model Milton's poem on the late massacre at Piedmont, and that helped me think about how to address the poem. And then the form just came to me of using the girls' names, because I think that an elegy can use a name successfully sometimes, and that's what I try to do. It's not a poem I would ever read out loud to an audience. It's the kind of poem I feel works in the structure of my book, because my book is partly about innocence and worldliness. Soon after a review of my book came out, someone asked me to be on a public television program about forgiveness in relation to that poem, and I didn't want to be on it. I said no, because I think some things just poetry might be able to speak to, and then for me that's enough.
Hi. Does poem always have to carry a message, or can it be something else other than all the mechanics of it?
Well, that's a very good question as well. I don't think a poem ever should carry just a message, because then you could just give the message and that would suffice. I do think that poems are, as we say in literary criticism, are both over and underdetermined in their meaning, that the meaning is never finished And as long as there are readers for the poem, the meaning will continue to grow or continue to change. But also, I think the meaning of a poem always is invisible to the poet in many ways. It's only after many years that you might turn back to a book and see some kind of connection between poems or some preoccupation that was not very evident at the time. So I think there's no way to separate the meaning of a poem and, as you said, the mechanics, which I think of as this vital element of the form of the poem. I mean, the message is the form. The form is the way of conveying the feeling and conveying it intensely. So, and I also really love poems or parts of poems that don't have any meaning at all, like the nonsense refrains of ballads. It's really astonishing to think about singing a tragedy of lovers and then all of a sudden say parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme out of the blue. It gives the singer a chance to get some breath and think of the rest of the story, but it also gives some relief from the pain. A refrain gives you a break from the action of the poem in that tradition. So it's a great question and one that doesn't have just one answer.
I'm going to smuggle in a question unless, thanks. This grows out of a wonderful review of Red Rover and the Nation. And I'm going to disagree with something the reviewer says, but not about you, okay? Because the reviewer says both science and religion seek to shed light and shore up certainties. And then she says, perhaps poetry alone reserves a positive value for darkness. I agree with her about science seeking to shed light, but the notion that it seeks to shore up certainties seems to me patently untrue. And I'm not asking whether you agree or disagree with that statement, but I'm wondering, what is your sense of how a discipline like poetry and a discipline like science relate?
Well, I actually am in a faculty group at Princeton where all scientists and humanists are talking about what it is to be human. So I have a kind of intense sense of this right now. I mean, my basic sense is that science is this beautiful, formal process of knowledge that does reveal patterns where we haven't seen them before. The big difference for me between science and the work of poetry, let's take as an extreme example of humanist discourse, is that science can't really reflect on the significance of its own methods. It can't really reflect on what it's doing in the way that poetry can. I think also that in poetry, we have a sense of consciousness as a consciousness of something, that we're intending or desiring or directed towards something. And then part of our task in understanding that thing is to involve ourselves in it. Whereas, of course, a scientist must remove himself or herself in order to see.
I want to ask a couple of much simpler questions. You talked about the first poem that you remembered, Christina Rossetti. When did you think you might be able to become a poet, or when did you think you wanted to become a poet? And you refer to Milton, you refer to Wordsworth, you clearly see yourself in the great tradition of English poetry. How does that help you? How does that make writing poetry more difficult?
Well, I only take it as a help. I try not to let it be too imposing. I think that
Somebody is not overwhelmed by Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence.
I think that Harold Bloom gives girls a break in that front. This is an edible theory of poetry, but I find the resources of the past just the greatest trove of possibilities that there could be for poetry, and including, I would include any art form, not just poetry, but poetry particularly. And the poetry of my own language, of course, is of most importance to me because that's where the cadences are. That I am very interested in the larger tradition, the largest possible tradition, including vernacular forms. I wanted to write poetry from the time I was very small. I just wrote poems when I was a child. But I had an amazing thing happen. My mother, I've told this story before, but my mother took the first poems I wrote and embroidered them onto little pieces of linen and framed them. And I think if anyone had someone do that for him or her in writing poetry, that person would become a poet. So I think actually you have to teach children not to be poets, because most children want to be poets. They want to make sounds and take pleasure in language. So we should stop doing that. Stop stopping them.
The poet William Stafford was once asked in an interview, when did you start writing poetry? And he said, I don't remember, when did you stop? Which I think is somewhat like the...
That's right.
Relates to that question of...
He was a great enabler. You know, he also said something that he has his cure for writer's block. Do you know that?
Just
he
lower
said,
your
lower your standards, right? I say that to my students
And he
all
also
the time.
said, but be willing to accept that most of what you write won't amount to much.
That's all right.
It's a wonderful spirit. Again, I do not want to monopolize the questions. Come on up. See, if you wait them out, they always come.
This is a tough question. Do you think poetry is better than science?
No, not at all. I mean, I think better in what way? I mean, you're going away, so we won't answer it for you. No, I don't think it's a contest. They're just different ways of knowing things. And knowing different things, I would say.
I'll ask, I have a couple questions about the owl itself, the poem, which I think is just extraordinary. And a poem that's complex but inviting on the first read too, which I think it's one of the ways in which art can either set itself up as a puzzle that you want to inhabit, or it can say, come on in, and then it gets more complicated. It does perceive the world through peripheral vision, which I think was certainly, whether it was your intention, it was certainly what the poem does. There's that imperative, not quite in the middle, but close, where you say, so look it up. Just before the line measure changes, the kinds of details change, and so does the music of the poem, the internal mouth sounds. And I was just wondering, to look something up is to check the facts, and I'm interested in that phrase's relationship to the poem, as you see it, and how do you engage with, how does your imagination engage with fact and information? How does information work for your imagination?
Well, I think you've zeroed in on the way that this is a kind of anti-Google poem.
Anti-what?
Google poem. Because, I do think that literature is not about information. It could be about information in part, but it's about understanding. And you can't, in an indexical relationship to meaning and a one-to-one relationship that information offers, have a sense of understanding. So I was struck when I didn't know what it was that I saw outside the window, that my resources for finding out were somewhat limited. They were limited to this blur, this sense of this something that I saw. And then I could look again. I could see if it happened again. It didn't happen again. And I'm very interested in poetry that's about things that happen once versus things that are repeated in time. I could, as you all know, because we were all masters of self-deception, I could convince myself that I knew what it was and keep doing that, but that didn't interest me. I could look at pictures of things that fly of various kinds, but what intrigued me was that it was so hard to figure out. And of course, this kind of winter sense of being indoors and knowing the world through a window, knowing the world through books, which is what my winters are like. I don't know about yours. I do get out and do other things, but I feel rather cooped up in the winter. And what kinds of knowledge that can provide about the world outside the window is partly the valence of the poem as well.
If I may, I'm going to just ask another question about the owl. Anyone who listens to that poem carefully will hear in the early lines a whole lot of awe sounds. Thought, cloth, tossed, cloth, across, tablecloth, thought, cloth, lost. It's a cluster that one, if their ears are open, can't help but hear. And it made me think of what anyone who teaches poetry experiences sometimes, where the students will say, was she really conscious of that? You know, when we notice all these things. And I usually answer, sure she was by draft 153, or I answer, why does it matter? I'm interested in your relationship between the unconscious at work, where the poem in its draft form speaks to you, and when that becomes conscious and how the two interrelate.
Yeah, I think that has a really interesting history in the composition of poetry, because I often find that something just doesn't feel right, or I find myself adjusting all the sounds, or I'm adjusting the rhythm of a line. Later on, I could give a name to that adjustment, as you just have. But initially, I often just intuit it. I feel that it's correct. And, you know, I don't like to give poetry readings very much, but I find them really helpful, because often in the exposure of really projecting a poem, you can see something that just doesn't sound right, even though it might technically be working. I also wanted to say something in answer to your earlier question about looking down and looking up, because I also was really struck in trying to understand this phenomenon, whatever it was, that you know, that all does work in both directions, that the all of the astronomer has to do with a different notion of depth than the all of the reader, reading a book that's full of meaning in some way, and yet they are related. And where we are on that vertical hinge really interested me a great deal here.
I just got the pun on awe and the awe sounds. You know, that.
Oh, you didn't mean to point that out?
Freud's always with us, but I just, it is the sound I hear, but I just got the awe.
Stephen, nobody is hearing it. The audience is not hearing you. Stand up and repeat that for the
It wasn't that
microphone.
important. Go ahead.
No, he said he wasn't aware of the awe sound when he asked the question, but I think if you keep this up, that you'll be charging us for your time. The unconscious will be working.
I want to go back to that vertical hinge and something you just said. You were interested in things that weren't repeating phenomena. You were interested in one-time events. Yet one of the devices you use frequently in your poems is repetition. And the repetition seems so simple, and it seems so constricted in a way, the way the names of the 5 little girls in some ways is a closed, constricted circle. But somehow, and I want you to tell me how, somehow you're able to move on that hinge. You're able to widen that circle. You're able to go from one discrete, carefully observed event to a whole universe. How do you do that?
Well, I think I'm interested in repetition, especially in side poems, because they do add an oral effect to a written poem. Sometimes readers have very little tolerance for reading repetitions on the page, and it's a matter of figuring out that balance. I think they also are one device we have for slowing down the reader and throwing the reader back to the lines before one moves on. The other thing, though, that interests me a great deal is structuring books so that the sequentiality of a book is set up in tension with the repetition of patterns that are going on throughout the book, throughout the sections. So I just like to work in every direction and see how much I can saturate a book with those forms of motion. I don't like, to have my reader finish a poem and feel that it's over. I like to try to compel the reader to read again or to go back. I think the great poet in our tradition, in English tradition, who knows these kinds of techniques is George Herbert, who often works with architectural forms, but constantly is throwing the reader back to deeper levels of apprehension. So there are lots of ways of learning. Of course, this is an obsession of Yeats's as well. and many other poets. Okay.
Who do you read for nourishment? Does poetry make you want to write poetry? Does reading poetry make you want to write poetry?
Well, I actually teach poetry all the time. I teach the history of poetry. I don't teach creative writing. So I'm constantly nourished by teaching the tradition. But I also like to read poems that I don't teach, of contemporary poems sometimes. But I read, every day I read novels. I try to read some part of a novel every day. And that keeps me absorbed in those narrative forms that are actually not very important for my poetry, but also projects me constantly in scenes and gives me that kind of negative capability that the novel can give you of understanding other lives and imagining other lives. And when I'm writing poems, I like to imagine lots of imaginary people reading them as well as real people.
A wrap-up question, if no one else has any. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
See, you say wrap up, and somebody says unwrap.
Just wondering if you could say a bit more about those deeper forms of apprehension. You began with your recollection of the Christina Rossetti poem, and for whatever reason that came into your mind at that moment. And you also spoke about the way in which returning to a poem throughout life, we see it differently through different circumstances, but perhaps also it's changed us at some level. I mean, could you say something about the relation between memory and repetition in the movement deeper in?
I'm sorry, the last word you said?
If you could say something about the relation between memory and repetition in that movement into deeper forms of perception.
I think movement is the key word here, because I think that at those moments when we do see into things, that it's often because we've been able to somehow move along with them. We've been able to be moved and see them as processes of transformation. And so it's not just a matter of using the senses, but I also think it's tied to a sense of music, which I also should have mentioned is something I find very nurturing, or also a sense of mood or nuance. If you see those things that appear to us as being, bringing down a set of changes, or having being a myriad in the perspectives that they offer, then there's always a possibility of seeing into something. The times when we can't see into things, I think, have to do with the necessities of life, that we have to grasp something, or we have to use it, or we have to imagine it in its finitude. But I think that poetry helps us understand that not only art forms, but persons have those kinds of myriad complexities, and save us from just simply using things.
Somebody want to unwrap before I wrap up? I have it's the does poetry matter question. I hope it's phrased a little more interestingly than that. Talked about that poetry is a slow art form. I think especially lyric poetry is also among the most individual of art forms. A friend of mine refers to it as one interior life speaking to another, which I think is quite beautiful. But how does, I don't mean it that big a question, but how does poetry speak to our so-called world, to use Cummings' expression? How does it speak to the culture at large? Is it enough for you as a poet that it seems poetry is written for a fit audience, if few? Should the audience be bigger? Does that matter?
Well, the size of the audience doesn't matter to me. I mean, it's the commitment of the audience, or the commitment of the reader. But I do think that literature is truly the great resource we have of the inner lives of the dead. It's that way that we carry our interior lives forward in time. There's really nothing else that gives us that kind of access. the inner life. So I completely agree with that. Now, the role of poetry in that is quite specific, I often think, because especially lyric poetry, where you have this I and you and I, where you have an intense single speaker, individual persons matter, their existence matters in poetry in a way that it can't matter in other forms of discourse often. So I think as long as we care about the inner life of individual persons, then poetry will be irrepressible. And it also, in addition to this intensity of singularity, it has this great universality in the whole compass of its rhythms and forms. So it's just the most fantastic form for the greatest expansion and the greatest concentration. You know, I'm a little suspicious of touting the art form that I practice, but I do think that there's a reason why it constantly is given a certain sacred value in cultures.
Maybe not enough in this culture.
Well, this culture's not finished, that's for sure.
It's nice to end on an optimistic note.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Stewart.